Elena Marlowe pressed her lips against Damien Moretti's and felt the entire world stop breathing. She had done it without thinking, without planning, without any idea what it would cost her. 1 second she was looking for an exit. The next second her hands were on his chest, and her mouth was on his, and the most dangerous man in Chicago was completely, utterly still. When she pulled back, her heart was slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "That kiss was a mistake," she whispered. Damien looked at her for a long, terrifying moment. And then he said 4 words that rewrote the rest of her life. If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel and follow Elena and Damien's story all the way to the end, because nothing about this journey is what you expect. And drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The auction house smelled like old money and fresh lies. Elena Marlowe had been inside the Caldwell Gallery twice before, once to repair a 16th-century Flemish oil painting that had suffered water damage along its lower border, and once to appraise a donated bronze sculpture that turned out to be a very expensive fake. Both times, she had slipped in through the service entrance, done her work quietly, and left before anyone important noticed she existed. That was how Elena preferred things. Invisible, careful, safe. Tonight was supposed to be the same. Her supervisor, Margaret Chen, had asked her to represent the museum at the annual Preservation Society charity auction. It was a social obligation more than anything else. Show up, smile, shake a few hands, make sure someone from the Hargrove Museum was seen supporting the cause. Elena had dressed in the only formal gown she owned, a simple dark green dress she had worn to exactly 3 events in the past 4 years, and arrived precisely on time with no intention of staying longer than 90 minutes. She had even calculated her exit. Collect the paddle number at the registration table. Find a seat near the back. Applaud politely during the opening remarks. Bid on something small and affordable to justify her presence. Leave by 9:30. Stop for soup on the way home. Be in bed by 11. That was the plan. The plan lasted exactly 47 minutes. It ended when Elena went looking for a restroom, took the wrong turn at the end of the second-floor corridor, and pushed open a door that was supposed to be a private powder room, but turned out to be a meeting room, where 7 men in expensive suits were having a conversation that nobody outside that room was ever supposed to hear. She froze in the doorway. The men froze at the conference table. 7 pairs of eyes turned toward her at exactly the same moment. Elena's first instinct was to apologize and back out. "Wrong room, so sorry. Carry on." She could feel the words forming in her mouth, polite and automatic and completely harmless. But then she saw what was spread across the conference table. Photographs, documents, maps of city districts with sections circled in red. A ledger open to a page dense with numbers. And in the center of everything, a clear plastic sleeve containing what looked unmistakably like evidence, financial evidence, the kind that belonged in a prosecutor's office, not a charity auction. Her brain made the calculation before she could stop it. She recognized one of the men seated at the far end of the table. Alderman Richard Crane. She had seen his face on campaign posters throughout the North Side last spring. He was running for city council on a platform about urban preservation and community investment. He was sitting in a room full of documents that should not exist, at a meeting that had clearly never been scheduled on any official calendar, with men Elena had never seen in any photograph connected to public life. And at the head of the table, watching her with an expression that was completely, unnervingly calm, was a man she had absolutely no trouble recognizing. Damien Moretti. She had never seen him in person before. Nobody she knew had ever seen him in person. He existed in the way certain forces of nature existed, as something you knew was real because you could see its effects everywhere around you, even if you never directly witnessed the source. He was 32 years old. He had inherited leadership of the Moretti organization at 24 after his father died of a stroke in the middle of a very tense negotiation with a rival family. He had spent the 8 years since then methodically rebuilding every aspect of the organization his father had run on pure intimidation, and the result was something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous than what had come before. Nobody talked about the Moretti family the way they talked about other crime organizations. There were no dramatic public incidents, no visible violence, no scandals that reached the newspapers. There was only the quiet, pervasive understanding that certain things happened in Chicago, that certain businesses stayed open and others didn't, that certain politicians received opportunities and others found their careers mysteriously stalled, and that behind all of it was a structure so carefully maintained that most people preferred not to examine it too closely. Damien Moretti was not a monster from a movie. He was something more unsettling than that. He was a man who had made the system work for him so completely that the system had stopped noticing he was doing it. Elena knew all of this in the way any Chicago resident knew it, as background knowledge, as city mythology, as something to acknowledge and then set aside because it had nothing to do with her life. Until this moment, he was looking at her across the conference table with dark eyes that gave away nothing. And Elena realized, with a slow, cold certainty, that she had approximately 3 seconds to decide what to do before the situation decided for her. She backed up one step. One of the other men moved immediately, a large man near the door, built like someone who had spent decades solving problems that required physical solutions. His hand came up in a gesture that was not quite a threat, but was absolutely a barrier. "Hold on," he said quietly. Elena held on. She stood in the doorway of a room she should never have entered, in a building full of wealthy people sipping champagne one floor below, and she understood with complete clarity that the night she had carefully planned was over. Damien Moretti rose from his chair. He did it slowly, without urgency, like a man standing up from a dinner table after finishing a pleasant meal. He straightened his jacket. He walked around the end of the conference table with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his adult life encountered a situation he couldn't control. He stopped about 4 feet from her. "You took the wrong turn," he said. It was not a question. "I was looking for the restroom," Elena said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which surprised her almost as much as the situation itself. "Second floor, south corridor," he said. "This is the north corridor." "I see that now." He studied her for a moment. She had the distinct impression he was cataloging details: her face, her dress, the museum badge still clipped to her small clutch from the registration table. "Hargrove Museum," he read, glancing at the badge. "I'm here for the auction." "I know why you're here," he said. "I'd like to know what you saw." She met his eyes and felt the full weight of the moment press down on her. She could lie. She could say she hadn't seen anything, that she had barely gotten a glimpse before backing out, that the documents meant nothing to her. It was a reasonable lie. It was probably the smart lie. But something about the way he was looking at her, not threatening, not performing, just watching with that quiet, measuring attention, made the lie feel impossible. "I saw Alderman Crane sitting at that table," she said carefully. "I saw documents that don't look like anything that should be in a charity auction building. And I know who you are." The room behind Damien was completely silent. He tilted his head slightly. "Most people," he said, "would have pretended they didn't see anything. I'm not most people." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, barely a flicker, but it was there. "No," he said. "Apparently not." The large man near the door took a step forward. Elena felt every muscle in her body tighten. "Mr. Moretti," the man said quietly. "She can't. I know what she can't do, Vincent." Damien did not look away from Elena. "Give us a moment." Vincent did not look pleased, but he stopped moving. Damien studied Elena for a long beat. She held her ground, which cost her considerably more than she let show. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena Marlowe." "Miss Marlowe." He said it quietly, like he was tasting the sound of it. "I'm going to ask you something, and I'd like an honest answer." "You can ask. Are you afraid of me right now?" She considered lying again. Considered telling him she wasn't afraid, that she had walked into situations like this before, that she was completely composed. But he had asked for honesty, and something about this man, something she couldn't fully explain, made her want to answer him the same way. "Yes," she said, "but I'm not going to let that be the only thing I am." He was quiet for so long that the silence itself became a kind of pressure. Then he said, "All right, Miss Marlowe, here is what's going to happen. What happened next was not what she expected. He didn't threaten her. He didn't make her feel like a problem to be managed. He walked her back out into the corridor himself, calmly, as though they were two colleagues who had simply ended up in the wrong meeting, and he told her three things. First, she was going to go back downstairs and finish the evening without speaking to anyone about what she had seen. Second, she was going to go home afterward and not contact law enforcement, not contact journalists, not contact anyone whose involvement would complicate a situation that was already complicated enough. Third, and this was the part that stopped her, he told her that within 48 hours, every piece of information she had seen in that room would no longer exist in its current form, and that whatever she thought she had witnessed was already being resolved through channels that had nothing to do with her. "I'm not asking you to approve," he said. "I'm asking you to stay uninvolved." Elena looked at him. "Why are you explaining this to me?" she said. "You could just—" She didn't finish the sentence. He finished it for her. "I could just make sure you don't remember what you saw, or make sure it doesn't matter that you remember." He said it without inflection, like he was reading a list. "Yes, I could, but you're not. I'm not." "Why?" He was quiet again. That unsettling, measuring quiet. "Because you didn't pretend," he finally said. "And I find that harder to dismiss than I should." She went back downstairs. She bid on a small decorative ceramic piece she didn't particularly want and would spend 6 months wondering what to do with. She shook 3 hands. She smiled at Margaret Chen's colleague and answered 2 questions about the museum's upcoming winter exhibition. And then she went home. She should have felt relieved. She had walked out of a situation that had no reasonable exit, and she had walked out intact. Instead, she sat on her kitchen floor, with her back against the refrigerator and her arms around her knees, and she thought about the way Damien Moretti had looked at her when she said she wasn't going to let fear be the only thing she was. Like it was the first honest thing anyone had said to him in a very long time. 3 days passed. On the 4th day, Elena's life changed in a way she had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. She was at work in the restoration lab, cleaning the surface of a damaged portrait with a cotton swab and a solution she had mixed herself when her supervisor appeared in the doorway with an expression that Elena had never seen on Margaret Chen's face before. "Fear Elena." Margaret's voice was carefully controlled. "There are 2 men downstairs who want to speak with you. I told them you were in the middle of a delicate piece and couldn't be interrupted, and they said—" She paused. "They said to tell you that Mr. Moretti sends his regards, and that it would be better for everyone if you came down." Elena set down the cotton swab. She pulled off her gloves. She went downstairs. The 2 men were waiting in the museum lobby, which was currently occupied by a school group of 11-year-olds, examining a case of ancient Egyptian artifacts. The men looked aggressively out of place, too still, too watchful, dressed in the particular way that said the suits were expensive and the men inside them were more expensive still. "Miss Marlowe," the taller of the 2 said. He had a flat, neutral voice. "We'd like you to come with us." "Am I being given a choice?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without elaborating. She thought about that answer for a moment. "Then I'll get my coat." They took her to a building in the West Loop that looked from the outside like an unremarkable commercial property, the kind that housed architectural firms or wealth management offices. Inside, it was different. Not dramatically different, not in a way that confirmed every crime drama she had ever seen, but different in the way that certain spaces felt when they were inhabited by people who operated at a level most people never encountered. Quiet, efficient, completely self-contained. Damien was waiting in an office on the 4th floor. He was on the phone when she walked in, but he ended the call immediately. He gestured to the chair across from his desk without standing, which she found interesting, not rude exactly, but a conscious signal about how this was going to go. He was in control, she was a guest. Those were the terms. She sat down. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You sent 2 men to my workplace," she said. "I'm not sure coming is the right word." Fair point. Something that might have been amusement moved briefly across his face. "I'll be direct. A problem has developed. Involving me? Involving the fact that you were in that room." He leaned back in his chair. Someone saw you leave with me. Someone who has an interest in knowing everything about everyone connected to me, even tangentially. Your name came up in a conversation yesterday that I found concerning. Elena felt a slow, cold stillness move through her. What kind of conversation? The kind where your name shouldn't be mentioned at all. He watched her process that. A man named Gerald Forsyth runs a competing organization. He's been looking for leverage against me for 3 years. He is thorough, methodical, and entirely willing to use people he considers harmless as instruments of pressure. I'm harmless, Elena said. You were harmless, he said. That changed when someone saw you with me. She was quiet for a moment. So, what does that mean for me? It means, he said carefully, that your current level of visibility is insufficient to protect you, and your current level of connection to me is insufficient to discourage interference. She looked at him. I don't know what either of those things means in practical terms. It means, he said, that I would like you to agree to something that will protect you in the short term, and that will require something from you that I recognize is not a small thing to ask. What do you want? He paused. I want you to let people believe that you matter to me. The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the distant sound of traffic 11 floors below. I'm sorry, she said. You want me to pretend to be what, exactly? Someone under my personal protection, he said. Not my partner. I'm not asking you to perform a relationship. I'm asking you to be seen with me enough times, in the right contexts, that Forsyth decides you're not a useful pressure point. That you're protected rather than vulnerable. And in exchange, I make sure that nothing from the other night follows you in any way that damages your life. She studied him across the desk. You're asking me to trust you, she said. I am. Why would I do that? He was quiet for a moment. She had the sense that he was deciding something, choosing a level of honesty that didn't come naturally to him. Because I'm not going to pretend I'm someone you should trust on the basis of character, he said. I'm asking you to trust me because I'm being honest with you about what I am and what this situation is. And because I have the ability to keep you safe in a way that nothing else in your current life can. She looked at him for a long time. I want one condition, she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. I won't be managed, she said. If I do this, I do it as myself. I don't become someone who smiles and says nothing. If I think you're wrong about something, I will tell you. Something moved through his expression, something she couldn't quite name. That, he said quietly, is not a condition I expected. Is it a condition you'll agree to? He was silent. Yes, he said. She agreed to 1 month, 4 weeks of being seen with Damien Moretti, in context that would be noticed by the right people. A dinner here, an event there. The kind of visible, unremarkable presence that said she mattered to him without announcing anything dramatic. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself it was a practical solution to an impractical situation. She told herself, every single day of that first week, that she was not developing a complicated feeling about the way Damien Moretti listened to her, not just heard, but listened in a way that almost no one in her life had ever done. The first dinner was a restaurant in River North that she would normally never have been able to afford. He arrived before her and stood when she came to the table, which surprised her more than she expected. She had prepared herself for the performance of courtesy, the kind of surface-level consideration that powerful men used as social currency. She had not prepared herself for the possibility that it might be genuine. They talked for 3 hours. Not about his world. Not about the arrangement. They talked about her work, about restoration, about the science and the art of it, about what it meant to spend your days making broken things whole again. He asked questions that were specific and thoughtful, questions that showed he had actually listened to what she said before asking the next one. At one point he said, "You love it. The work? You love it the way people love things that make their actual life feel real." She looked at him across the table. That's an unusually perceptive thing to say. I grew up surrounded by people who did things for money or power or obligation, he said. I notice when someone does something because it's genuinely theirs. What do you do for the same reason? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Nothing, he said. Not anymore. It was the most honest thing she had heard him say. And it was the moment Elena Marlowe understood, with a slow, uncomfortable certainty, that Damien Moretti was going to be far more difficult to remain indifferent to than she had planned. Halfway through the second week, she came to the building in the West Loop after work because she had a question about a scheduled event, and she found Damien in his office with a man she didn't recognize, someone older, with a face that had been weathered into hard angles and eyes that moved over her like she was a complication. Damien saw her in the doorway and said without hesitation, "Come in." The older man looked at Damien. "This is the woman?" "This is Elena," Damien said. Just that, as if her name were a complete answer. The older man looked at her for a moment, then looked back at Damien. "She doesn't belong in this conversation. She belongs wherever I say she belongs," Damien said. His voice was calm and entirely flat. "Finish what you were telling me." The older man, she learned later that his name was Anton, and that he had been her father's most trusted lieutenant for 30 years, looked at her one more time with an expression she couldn't fully read, and then looked back at Damien and said, "Forsyth knows about the Mercer account. He's going to move on it by the end of the month." Damien nodded slowly. "Then we move first," he said. Elena stood in that office and watched Damien Moretti make a decision in approximately 3 seconds that would have taken most people 3 weeks of meetings and analysis, and she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not the power. She had already known about the power. What she saw was the weight of it, the way he carried it alone, the way there was nobody in that room, nobody, as far as she could tell, in any room who functioned as anything other than a voice delivering information for him to process. He had allies, he had lieutenants, he had people who depended on him, and people who feared him, and people who benefited from his protection. He did not have anyone who sat with him after the decision was made. After Anton left, Elena stayed. He looked at her. "You don't have to tell me what the Mercer account is," she said. "It's not your problem. You told me I could say what I think." A beat. "The Mercer account," he said slowly, "is a financial structure that protects a significant number of people from a significantly bad situation. If Forsyth gets to it before we can restructure it, a lot of people who trusted us will be exposed." "Trusted you," she said. "Yes, that bothers you." It was not a question. He looked at her for a long moment. "More than it should," he said. "Why more than it should?" "Because in this world, people losing trust in you is sometimes the cost of survival. I have accepted that as a fact for 8 years. He paused. "I find I am less comfortable with that fact than I used to be." Elena thought about what he had said at dinner, about doing nothing for the genuine reason anymore. "Maybe," she said carefully, "that's not a bad development." He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. The kiss happened on the 15th day. It happened because Elena did the one thing she had absolutely committed herself not to do. She forgot, for a single unguarded moment, that the situation was an arrangement. They had been at an event, a private gallery opening, attended by exactly the kind of people whose attention the arrangement was designed to manage. Elena had been standing near a large abstract painting, looking at it, when a man she didn't recognize stopped beside her and introduced himself. His name was Thomas Harwick. He was polite and well-dressed and entirely too interested in the details of how she had met Damien and how long they had known each other. The questions were smooth, but the structure underneath them was visible to her. She had spent enough time around people who wanted information she wasn't supposed to give to recognize the shape of it. She answered carefully, but then Harwick said something that stopped her cold. "Mr. Moretti seems very protective of you," he said pleasantly. "I wonder what it is about you, specifically, that holds his attention." He's not usually the type to be distracted. The word distracted came with a very specific undertone. Not a compliment. A probe. Elena looked at him. "I think," she said carefully, "that's a question you should ask him directly." "I'm asking you," Harwick said. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Because the impression I've gotten from people who have known Damien for a long time is that he doesn't attach himself to civilians, especially not ones with no obvious leverage." Elena's mind was working very fast. This was someone sent to assess her, to determine whether she was genuine or strategic. And if he reported back that she seemed uncertain, or that the connection between her and Damien had the particular awkward quality of something manufactured. She did not think about it. She turned toward Damien, who was 20 feet away in a conversation with two other men, and she walked to him, and she put her hand on his arm, and when he turned toward her, she rose up on her toes, and she kissed him. She meant it to be brief, a performance, a clear enough signal that there was nothing uncertain here. But the moment her lips touched his, something happened that she had not planned for. He kissed her back, not desperately, not dramatically, but completely with a focus and a certainty that made the performance feel, for exactly 3 seconds, like the realest thing that had happened to her in years. Then she stepped back. The room continued around them. Glasses clinked. Conversations continued. Thomas Harwick was watching from across the gallery with an expression she couldn't see clearly from this distance. Damien was looking at her. His expression was completely composed. But his eyes were doing something she had not seen them do before. "That kiss," she said quietly, "was a mistake." He looked at her for a long, silent moment. "No, Elena," he said. His voice was low, certain, and entirely without performance. "The mistake was believing you were powerless before you met me." She had no answer for that. She stood in the middle of a gallery full of people, while the most dangerous man in the city looked at her, like she had just said something that would stay with him for a very long time. And Elena Marlowe, who had spent her entire adult life choosing invisible and careful and safe, felt something shift inside her that she had no name for yet. But she already understood, in the part of herself that had always recognized the truth before she was ready to say it, that her careful, quiet, invisible life had just ended. And something she couldn't plan for had already begun. Nobody talked about the kiss. That was the part Elena couldn't stop thinking about in the days that followed. Not the kiss itself, though she thought about that too, more than she intended to, but the silence around it. Damien didn't mention it the next morning when Vincent delivered a schedule of upcoming appearances. He didn't reference it during the brief phone call 2 days later when he needed to confirm a detail about her work schedule. He behaved, with complete consistency, as though nothing had shifted, which meant either he had genuinely filed it under irrelevant, or he was a far more disciplined person than anyone she had ever met. She couldn't decide which answer bothered her more. What she knew for certain was this: Thomas Harwick had filed a report. She didn't know the contents, but she knew it had happened because Damien told her directly, without softening it, when she arrived at the West Loop building on a Thursday evening and found him standing at his office window with the particular stillness that she was beginning to recognize as him, thinking through something he hadn't fully resolved yet. "Harwick works for Forsyth," he said without turning around. He reported back 2 days ago. "I had someone intercept the communication." "What did it say?" He turned then. "That you're genuine," he said. "That whatever exists between us reads as real to anyone paying attention." She stood very still. "So the arrangement is working," she said. "In that respect, yes." Something in the way he said those 4 words made her look at him more carefully. "What's the other respect?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. That particular quiet she had learned to wait out, because pushing it only made him go further inside it. "Forsyth has moved the timeline," he finally said. "Whatever he was planning to do at the end of the month, he's accelerating it. The fact that you appear to matter to me has made you more interesting to him, not less." The cold that moved through her was different from the cold she had felt in the auction house corridor. That had been fear of the unknown. This was fear of something specific. "I thought the point was to make me less useful as leverage," she said. "It is. But Forsyth doesn't think the way most people do." Damien crossed his arms. There was something in his posture, a tightness he wasn't quite hiding that she hadn't seen before. "He's decided that if you're significant enough for me to protect publicly, you're significant enough to take." She let that settle. "Take," she repeated. "Not permanently. He doesn't want a war. He wants a conversation where he controls the terms." Damien's jaw tightened slightly. "He wants to use you to get me in a room where I'm on the defensive." Elena sat down in the chair across from his desk, not because her legs gave out, though they came close. Because she needed to think, and thinking required being still. And she was finding it increasingly difficult to be still in this office when Damien was looking at her with an expression that said he was angry about this, in a way he hadn't planned to be. "So what do we do?" she asked. "I'm handling it." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now, Damien." She said his name deliberately the way she had learned, stopped him from retreating back into the controlled efficiency he used when he didn't want to be questioned. "I am the one Forsyth wants to take. I think I'm entitled to more than I'm handling it." He looked at her. She looked back. Something behind his eyes shifted, like a door opening just slightly. "I'm moving you," he said. "Temporarily. Forsyth's people know where you live, where you work, what your routine looks like. The only way to disrupt his plan is to disrupt your accessibility. Move me where here, or to one of my properties," he said it flatly. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like I'm losing my entire life," she said. "Temporarily. You keep saying temporarily. Because it's true." He held her gaze. 3 weeks, maybe 4, until I've resolved the Forsyth situation in a way that removes you from the equation permanently." She was quiet for a moment. And if I say no, he was quiet for longer than she expected. "Then I make other arrangements," he said. "But they'll be less effective and considerably more complicated." She recognized what he was doing. He was giving her the choice, actually giving it, not performing the offer, and then overriding it. It was the same quality she had noticed from the very beginning, underneath all the control and the power and the careful management of everything around him. When Damien Moretti told you something was your decision, he meant it. Which made it considerably harder. "I need to tell Margaret something," she said. "I'll handle the museum." "No," she said firmly. "I'll handle the museum. Margaret trusts me. If someone calls her on my behalf without warning, she'll panic. I'll tell her I need personal leave. I have it accumulated." He nodded. "Tonight," he said. "I know." She left the building, called Margaret from the street, felt the weight of a half-truth settling into the conversation like sediment. A family situation. Nothing serious, but needing attention. She would check in about the Flemish portrait. She was sorry for the short notice. Margaret was kind about it, which made it worse. Elena hung up the phone and stood on the sidewalk outside the West Loop building and gave herself exactly 60 seconds to feel the full scope of what her life had become since she took a wrong turn at a charity auction. Then she went back inside. The property Damien arranged was a townhouse in Lincoln Park, not his primary residence, he explained, but a place he maintained for purposes that he didn't fully elaborate and she didn't press him on. It was well furnished without being ostentatious, the kind of space that said the person who owned it had excellent taste and no interest in impressing anyone with it. Elena was given her own floor. She was also given Vincent. Vincent, she quickly discovered, was the most comprehensively unmovable person she had ever encountered. He didn't follow her around the townhouse, that would have been too obvious. He simply existed in whatever space was adjacent to hers with the patient permanence of a very large piece of furniture. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He didn't express opinions. He answered direct questions with minimum information and maximum accuracy. She decided to consider him a challenge. "How long have you worked for Damien?" she asked, on the second morning, over coffee she had made herself, because she refused to have someone make her coffee in a house where she was already a guest. 11 years, Vincent said. "How old were you when you started?" A pause. 23. "So you were 23 and Damien was—" 21, Vincent said. She looked at him. "He was 21 and you were already working for him?" "He was 21 and already running certain operations," Vincent said carefully. His father was still officially in charge then. But in practice— He stopped. "In practice, Damien was already running things," Elena finished. Vincent said nothing, which was confirmation enough. What was he like? At 21. Vincent was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Harder," he finally said. "He was harder then." She thought about that. "What changed?" Vincent looked at her steadily. "That is not my story to tell." Damien came to the townhouse that evening. He came every evening, she would discover, which was both reassuring and deeply unsettling, in ways she hadn't fully mapped yet. He came after whatever the day had required of him, And he sat in the kitchen, not the formal sitting room, the kitchen, and he asked her how the day had been. Not as a social formality, as an actual question. The second evening, she asked him why he always chose the kitchen. He looked around for a moment, as though noticing it for the first time. My mother spent most of her time in the kitchen, he said. When things were very bad, when my father's world was bleeding into everything else, the kitchen was the one place that felt separated from it. Elena looked at him. He seemed briefly aware that he had said more than he intended. He picked up his coffee cup. "What did you do today?" he asked, redirecting with the efficiency of a man who had spent years controlling the trajectory of every conversation. "I reorganized your book collection," she said. "You have very specific gaps. Excellent instincts about contemporary fiction, but nothing pre-20th century except a few history texts." He blinked. "You reorganized my books. You said I could treat the space as mine for the duration." "I didn't mean." He stopped, something that might have been amusement moved across his face. "How did you determine they had gaps?" "By reading the spines." "It took most of the afternoon." She paused. "You have 4 copies of the same collection of essays about organizational theory. They're useful. Nobody needs 4 copies of the same useful book." "I give them to people," he said, "when I think they need to read something." She looked at him. "You give people books," she said. "Occasionally. The most feared man in Chicago gives people books he thinks they need to read." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough that she felt it like something landing softly in the middle of her chest. "Don't," he said. "Don't what? Don't look at me like I'm less complicated than you thought." "I don't think you're less complicated," she said. "I think you're differently complicated." He was quiet. "That," he said, after a moment, "might be the most accurate thing anyone has said about me." On the 4th day, everything changed. Elena was reading in the second-floor sitting room when she heard voices from below, not raised voices, but voices with a particular quality that made her put down the book and go very still. The quality of a conversation happening under careful control because the alternative was something much louder. She recognized Damien's voice. She recognized Vincent's. The third voice was one she hadn't heard before, a woman's voice, low and precise, and carrying an authority that didn't ask for permission. Elena stayed where she was. 20 minutes later, Damien appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, with an expression that told her something significant had happened, and he was deciding how much of it to give her. "Who was that?" she asked. "My aunt," he said. "Carlotta Moretti." He said the name the way people said the names of natural phenomena: hurricanes, fault lines, things that shaped landscapes simply by existing. What did she want? He came into the room and sat in the chair across from her, the first time she had seen him sit anywhere in the townhouse other than the kitchen. "She came to tell me that 3 of our financial structures have been compromised," he said. Not by Forsyth, by someone inside. The silence that followed had a different weight than any silence she had sat with him through before. "Inside," she said. "Someone in my organization has been providing information to Forsyth for at least 4 months. His voice was completely flat. "Everything Forsyth knows about the Mercer account, about my movements, about the timeline of my arrangements, all of it came from someone who has been sitting at my table." She watched his face and saw what he was working very hard not to show. Not anger, not cold strategic calculation. Betrayal. The kind that didn't come from strangers. "How many people knew about the Mercer account?" she asked quietly. 6. "And the timeline of your arrangements?" 4. She did the calculation, and the overlap between those 2 groups. He looked at her, too, he said. She held very still. "Damien," she said, "do you know which one?" A long pause. "I have a strong suspicion," he said, "and I am hoping I'm wrong." She understood then, from the particular way he said it, from the control in his voice that was costing him something visible, that the person he suspected was someone he cared about. Not romantically, but in the way that long loyalty built its own form of attachment, and betrayal from inside that attachment was a different category of wound than any external threat. "Anton," she said. She didn't know why she said it. Some combination of what she had observed in that first meeting in the office, the way the older man had looked at her, the particular quality of his expression when Damien had told him She belonged wherever Damien said she belonged. The flash of something across Damien's face confirmed it before he could control it. "Don't," he said. "I'm not judging," she said quickly. "I'm not Damien. I'm not trying to—" "I know." He cut her off gently. "I know you're not." She watched him sit with something he clearly had no practice sitting with. "He's been with your family for 30 years, she said. 31. That's not a small thing to lose." He looked at her. And in his eyes, beneath all the discipline and the control, and the 8 years of becoming the person the organization needed him to be, she saw something that looked very much like grief. "No," he said. "It isn't." She didn't say anything else. She didn't try to fix it or reframe it or offer him the comfort of a perspective that would make it smaller than it was. She just sat there, in the room with him, while he carried something heavy. And she understood, in a way she hadn't before, why that mattered. Not because he needed fixing, because he had never had anyone simply stay. 3 hours later, Carlotta Moretti came back. This time she came upstairs. She was a woman of about 60, with the kind of face that had been beautiful once, and had settled into something more formidable with age. She wore dark colors and no jewelry, and she moved with the quiet precision of someone who had spent decades being the most alert person in every room she entered. She looked at Elena the way a scientist looked at an unexpected experimental result. "You're the restoration specialist," she said. "Yes." "From the Hargrove Museum, yes." Carlotta was quiet for a moment. She looked around the sitting room, at the reorganized bookshelves, at the 2 cups of coffee on the side table, at the particular arrangement of the space that said 2 people had been spending real time in it. "My nephew," she said, "has brought exactly 2 women to properties he controls in 11 years of running this organization. One of them was a diplomatic arrangement that lasted 6 weeks and ended without incident. The other—" she paused. "You." Elena said nothing. "I want to understand what you are to him," Carlotta said. Not unkindly, but with the directness of someone who had no use for social cushioning. "I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that," Elena said. "You're exactly the right person," Carlotta said. "Everyone else gives me the answer they think I want. You'll give me the true one, because you don't know yet not what answer would benefit you." Elena considered that for a moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that I'm someone who ended up in a situation I didn't choose, and who found that the person at the center of it was considerably more than what I expected. And I think he found the same thing about me." She paused. "Beyond that, I genuinely don't know." Carlotta studied her. "He listened to you," she said. "I could tell, just from the arrangement of this room. He sat here with you, and he actually listened." "Yes." "Do you know how rare that is?" "I'm beginning to understand it," Elena said. Carlotta was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Elena would think about for a very long time afterward. "My brother, Damien's father, was a man who believed that emotion was the enemy of power. He raised Damien inside that belief from the time Damien was old enough to understand it. He didn't do it out of cruelty. He did it because he was afraid." She paused. "Afraid that if Damien felt things fully, he would be destroyed by this world. So he taught him to close it off." Elena was very still. "The problem," Carlotta said, "is that closing it off doesn't make it go away. It just makes it build pressure." She looked at Elena with an expression that was impossible to fully read. "You are either the best thing that has happened to him in 11 years, Carlotta said, or you are going to break something in him that can't be repaired." She left before Elena could respond. Elena sat alone in the room and felt the full weight of that sentence settle over her like weather. The call came at 2 in the morning, Damien's phone. She heard it from her room, not the ring itself, but the quality of the silence that followed, the particular stillness that said someone was awake and receiving information they hadn't wanted. She got up. She found him in the kitchen, always the kitchen, standing at the counter, with his phone face down on the granite surface and his hand flat beside it and his head bowed forward slightly, a posture she had never seen from him before. "Damien." He didn't look up immediately. "It was Anton," he said. She had known it was coming. Knowing it was coming did not make it easier to hear. "They confirmed it?" she asked. "He confirmed it." A pause. "He called me." She crossed to the counter and stood across from him. He called you himself, she said. He said he wanted me to hear it from him. Damien's voice was completely controlled, and underneath it was something that had no control at all. He said Forsyth offered him something I couldn't: immunity for his son, who has been in a situation with a rival group in Detroit for the past 8 months. Anton's been protecting the boy by providing information to Forsyth in exchange for Forsyth's people backing off in Detroit. Elena processed that. He did it to protect his child, she said. Yes. And now he's calling you, because the arrangement fell apart. Forsyth took what he needed and withdrew the protection anyway. The boy is still exposed, and Anton has nothing left to trade. She looked at Damien across the counter and saw what this was. Not just a betrayal, a trap that had also consumed the man who set it. What are you going to do? She asked. He raised his head. She had never seen his face look quite like it did in that moment. Not broken, he was too disciplined for broken, but honest, stripped of the layer of control that he usually maintained between himself and everything else. I don't know, he said. She had never heard him say that before. She held his gaze. Then you figure it out, she said quietly. And while you're figuring it out, I'm going to make coffee. And you're going to sit down. And we're going to think through it together. He looked at her. Elena, sit down, Damien. A long pause. He sat down. And in the kitchen, at 2 a.m, while the world Damien Moretti had built was leaking from a wound 31 years in the making, Elena Marlowe put the kettle on and sat across from the most dangerous man in the city and waited for him to be ready to figure it out. Because that was what you did for someone. Not when it was easy. Not when it was safe. Not when the arrangement called for it. You stayed. And staying, Elena was beginning to understand, was the bravest thing she had ever done. At 5 a.m, just as the first gray light started coming through the kitchen window, Damien's phone rang again. He answered it. She watched his face as he listened, and she watched the controlled efficiencies come back into his expression, the part of him that processed threats and made decisions and moved through crises without flinching. But it came back differently than before, because when he hung up the phone, he looked at her first. Not at the wall, not at the middle distance where he usually processed things. At her. Forsyth has moved, he said. He's not waiting anymore. He's called a meeting, not with me. With the Caldwell Group. The people from the auction. She went still. He's trying to build a coalition, Damien said. Against me. And he's using what Anton gave him to make the case that I'm vulnerable. Are you? She asked. He looked at her steadily. I was, he said. Before tonight. What changed tonight? He was quiet for a moment. I stopped carrying it alone, he said. She felt that land somewhere deep in her chest. He stood up from the table. I need to make calls, he said. Several of them. It's going to take most of the day. He paused. I'd like you to be here when I'm done. I'll be here, she said. He looked at her for one more moment. That measuring, careful look that she had come to understand was him making sure something was real before he allowed himself to rely on it. Then he nodded. He picked up his phone. He walked out of the kitchen. And Elena sat alone with her coffee and the pale morning light and the understanding that something had crossed a line in the last few hours that neither of them had been expecting to cross. Damien Moretti had let someone in, and Elena Marlowe, who had spent her entire adult life choosing safe and invisible and careful, had walked in without hesitating. What neither of them knew yet was that the moment Forsyth heard about it, and he would hear about it, because someone always heard about everything, the nature of the danger surrounding her would change completely. Not because she was leverage anymore, but because she had become something far more threatening to a man like Gerald Forsyth. She had become the reason Damien Moretti had something to lose. The calls took 11 hours. Elena knew this because she counted them, not the calls themselves, but the hours, measuring time by the coffee she made and the meals she left outside the closed office door and the quality of the silence that came through the walls. Damien's voice was never loud enough to hear clearly, but the rhythm of it changed across the day. Morning was rapid, clipped, efficient, a man deploying resources. Afternoon was slower, more deliberate, a man negotiating. By evening, something had settled into a different register entirely, and Elena understood instinctively that whatever was being built on the other side of that door was nearly complete. Vincent stayed in the front of the townhouse. He didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. His presence was its own kind of information. The organization was on alert, and everything that happened inside this building was being monitored with careful attention. At 7 in the evening, Damien opened the office door. He looked like someone who had climbed a very long distance and arrived somewhere he hadn't expected the view to be worth it. "It's done," he said. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a book she hadn't read a single page of. "What's done?" The coalition Forsyth was building. He came to the kitchen and poured himself water, not coffee, not anything stronger, just water, and leaned against the counter. 3 of the 4 groups he approached have declined. The 4th is neutral. He no longer has the numbers to move against me publicly. "How did you do that in 11 hours? "I called in things I've been building for 8 years. He paused. "Favors, relationships, trust that I invested in without knowing when I would need to use it." Elena looked at him. "You never planned to use it for this," she said. "I planned to use it when someone moved against the organization directly," he said. "I didn't plan to use it because one man decided to build a case out of the private details of my personal life." She heard what he wasn't saying. "He used me," she said. "Specifically. The information Anton gave him included, yes." His jaw tightened. "He built the narrative around the idea that I'd made myself vulnerable by bringing someone outside the organization into my confidence. That I was compromised. And the groups he approached believed that. Some of them found it credible," he said. "Which is why I spent 11 hours reminding people that credible and true are not the same thing." He set down the glass. "And that my judgment over 8 years has been accurate enough to earn the benefit of the doubt." She absorbed this. "So it's over," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "The coalition is over," he said. "Forsyth is not." The way he said it made very clear that those were 2 entirely different problems, and that the second one was far from resolved. "What does he do now?" she asked. "He simplifies," Damien said. "He's lost the political option. So he goes back to what people like him always return to when complexity fails." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Elena sat with the knowledge that simplifying, for a man like Forsyth, meant exactly what the word implied. "One problem. One solution. No coalition required. He's going to come after you directly," she said. "He's going to try," Damien said. And for the first time in the conversation, something came into his voice that was not analysis or strategy or controlled certainty. Something that sounded like anger, the specific kind, that comes from having someone reach past everything you've built and aim at the thing underneath that you care about. "Damien." She said his name the way she had learned to say it, not as a question, but as an anchor. "Tell me what you need." He looked at her across the kitchen. "I need you to stay exactly where you are," he said. "Inside this building with Vincent, until I've resolved this." She had been expecting that answer, and she had her response ready. "No," she said. He went very still. "Elena, I have been sitting in this townhouse for 5 days," she said. "I have been cooperative. I have been patient, and I have trusted your process because you told me to, and because I believed you when you said it was working." She held his gaze. "But you just told me it's not fully working, and the reason it's not fully working is that Forsyth has decided I'm the simplest path to you. Which is exactly why you need to stay. Which is exactly why staying doesn't solve anything," she said. "You can't resolve Forsyth by hiding me. You can only resolve Forsyth by making hiding me unnecessary." He stared at her. "You sound like someone who understands this world," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. It wasn't quite not one either. "I've been paying attention," she said. "For 5 days I've had nothing to do but pay attention." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What are you proposing?" She had not expected him to ask that. She had expected another iteration of the same argument. The fact that he was asking told her something, that the 11 hours of calls had cost him more than he was showing, and that some part of him was genuinely willing to consider something other than what he'd already decided. "I want to meet Forsyth," she said. The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had ever sat inside. "Absolutely not," he said. Not alone, she said quickly. Not in a context he controls, but in a public setting with you, where he cannot do anything without consequences, and where I get to be more than a piece he moves around aboard. She leaned forward slightly. You told me the first night that you were honest about how dangerous you were. I'm asking you to be honest with me now. Is keeping me inside this building actually keeping me safer? Or is it just keeping me where you can see me? His silence answered her. Both, he finally said. It's both. I know, she said. But only one of those reasons is about my safety. He looked at her for a very long time. You are, he said slowly, considerably more difficult than I anticipated. You agreed to that on the first day, she said. You said it was a condition you'd accept. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was close enough. I did say that, he acknowledged. So, he turned away from the counter. He picked up his phone. He looked at it for a moment, then looked back at her. I need to think about this, he said. That's fine, she said. I'll be here. What neither of them knew in that kitchen was that the decision had already been made for them. Vincent appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:43, and the expression on his face, the particular quality of controlled urgency that Elena had never seen from him before, told her something had happened before he said a single word. There's a car outside, Vincent said. It's been there for 40 minutes. The plates come back to a shell company that traces to Forsyth's property management group. Damien was already moving. How many, he said. 2 visible. Probably 2 more we haven't located. He's watching, Damien said. Not a question. He moved faster than you expected, Vincent said. And there was something in his voice, a careful neutrality, that covered something that might have been an apology. Damien turned to look at Elena. She looked back at him. I wasn't wrong, she said quietly. Staying here isn't the solution. You were right, he said. The admission came without hesitation, which told her how serious the shift in the situation was. We're not staying. Where are we going? He looked at Vincent. The Meridian Building, Vincent said. It was clearly a prearranged option, a plan that existed, because Damien had planned for this contingency even while hoping he wouldn't need it. Is it secure? Elena asked. More secure than here, Damien said. And more public, which is its own kind of protection. They moved in 12 minutes. Elena had spent exactly none of her time in the townhouse unpacking beyond the necessities, so gathering what she needed took 4 minutes. The remaining 8 were Damien and Vincent doing something organized and rapid that she understood was a practiced procedure even if she had never seen it before. They left through the building's back access. The car outside didn't follow. Either it wasn't watching that exit, or the people in it were waiting for a signal that didn't come. Either way, Elena found herself in the back of a dark vehicle beside Damien Moretti, moving through Chicago at 8 in the evening, with the city's lights sliding past the windows, and the full weight of how completely her life had been remade in 17 days pressing down on her all at once. She didn't speak, neither did he, but after 3 blocks, his hand moved across the seat between them and settled beside hers, not taking her hand, not reaching for it, just placing his there. Close enough that the edges of their fingers were touching. She turned her hand over. He held it. Neither of them acknowledged it. The Meridian Building was exactly what it had been described as more public, which in practical terms meant it was a full-service building, with a daytime staff that continued into evening. Enough legitimate business activity on multiple floors that a surveillance vehicle outside would be visible and awkward, and enough of Damien's infrastructure distributed through it that moving resources in or out could be done without announcement. He had a residence on the top floor. It was the first time she had seen where he actually lived, and it told her things about him immediately. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't. It was spare in the way that spaces were spare when someone had simply never prioritized them. Functional furniture, good quality, no particular personality. A few books different from the collection in the townhouse, more worn, more read. One photograph on a shelf that she noticed but didn't look at too directly. He noticed her not looking at it. My mother, he said. She died when I was 16. She looked at it properly then. A woman with his eyes, or he had her eyes dark and attentive and carrying something that was warmth and wariness in equal proportion. She looks like someone worth missing, Elena said. She was the only person in my father's world who was kind without condition, he said. She never asked you to earn it. Elena turned to look at him. Is that rare? She asked. In your experience. He looked back at her steadily. It has been, he said. She understood the weight of that answer. She understood it because she was standing in his actual home, which he had never brought anyone to. She was certain of that without being told. The same way she was certain of the other things she had learned about him that he communicated without saying. And she was standing here not because of the arrangement, not because of Forsyth or the coalition or the compromised financial structures, but because he had reached across a car seat in the dark and put his hand next to hers. Tell me about the meeting, she said, the one you want me not to attend. He gave her a look. I said I'd think about it. You've had 40 minutes. Elena, Damien. He made a sound that was somewhere between resignation and something warmer. Forsyth has requested a formal conversation, he said. He reached out this afternoon during the calls. He proposed a meeting tomorrow evening at the Whitmore Club neutral ground, public enough to discourage anything immediate. He paused. He specified the meeting should be between representatives of both organizations. And you were going to go alone. I was going to bring Vincent and 2 others. That's not what I mean. He was quiet, he asked. Damien said carefully, whether you would be present. The cold that moved through her was sharp and fast. He asked for me specifically. Yes. She thought about what that meant. Forsyth had simplified, as Damien predicted. He had watched the townhouse. He had seen that hiding her wasn't working. He had changed tactics. Instead of taking her as leverage, he was requesting her presence at a meeting where he controlled the emotional architecture, where Damien would have to sit across a table from the man threatening the person he minus. She stopped that thought before it finished. He wants you off balance, she said. Yes. He thinks that if I'm in the room, he can make you reactive. Yes. And can he? The pause that followed was very brief. But it was there. He can try, Damien said. She read the truth underneath the answer. So I should go, she said. Because if I'm not there, he uses my absence as its own kind of leverage proof that you're protecting something you're afraid to expose. And if I am there, you control the narrative instead of reacting to his. He looked at her for a long, steady moment. When did you learn to think like this? He said. I've been watching you for 17 days, she said. And I'm a fast study. Something in his expression shifted, not the almost smile she had seen before, but something deeper than that. Something that said he was seeing her in a way he hadn't quite seen anyone before. You'd be walking into a room with a man who has been trying to use you as a weapon, he said. I know, he will say things designed to destabilize you. I know that too, Elena. He said her name differently this time. Not as an anchor, as something more careful. I need you to understand that if you're in that room, and he says something that frightens you, or threatens you, I cannot. He stopped. My response will not be professional. She looked at him. She understood exactly what he was saying, and what it cost him to say it. Then I'll make sure he doesn't get that far, she said quietly. He studied her for a long moment. Then he said, you'll need to know certain things before we walk in there. About Forsyth, about what he knows, about how he operates. Tell me. He sat down. She sat across from him. And for the next 2 hours, Damien Moretti told Elena Marlowe things he had told exactly no one outside the highest levels of his organization, because she needed to know them, and because he had decided, somewhere in the past 17 days, that she could be trusted with the parts of his world he had always kept completely closed. Gerald Forsyth was 61 years old and had built his organization on a philosophy that Damien explained with the particular clarity of someone who had studied an adversary long enough to understand him completely. He believes in predictability, Damien said. He believes that every person has a price, a pressure point, and a pattern of behavior that can be anticipated if you observe them long enough. He spent 40 years proving this theory correct, which has made him genuinely convinced that human beings are entirely knowable. And that makes him dangerous, Elena said. It makes him effective, Damien said. and it makes him vulnerable in one specific way. He doesn't account for people who don't fit the pattern, she said. Damien looked at her. Correct, he said. She thought about what that meant for tomorrow. He's going to try to map me, she said. He's going to look for the pressure point and the pattern. In the first 10 minutes, Damien said, before anything substantive is said. And if he can't find it, then he loses the meeting before it begins, Damien said. Forsyth without the psychological advantage is a man with resources but no strategy. He becomes reactive instead of deliberate. Elena nodded slowly. What does he want out of tomorrow, she asked. Publicly, he wants a negotiated agreement about territorial boundaries and financial structures. On paper, it's a business meeting. And privately, he wants me to concede that he has the leverage. Damien's voice was completely flat. He wants me to sit across that table and understand that he can reach the thing I care about most, and that my only option is to accommodate him. Elena was quiet for a moment. And if you don't concede that, she said. Then it continues, he said, and it escalates, until one of us makes a mistake. Or, she said slowly, until you walk in there with something he doesn't expect and change what the meeting is actually about. He looked at her steadily. What are you thinking, he said. I'm thinking, she said carefully, that Forsyth expects you to walk in tomorrow, either alone, which confirms I'm hidden and protected, and therefore vulnerable, or with me as a kind of proof that I exist and I'm intact. She paused. But what if I walked in, not as the thing you're protecting, but as someone who has something he needs? Damien's expression shifted slightly. Explain, he said. You told me the Mercer account was compromised. That Forsyth has the structural information Anton gave him. She leaned forward slightly. But I spent 5 days in your townhouse with access to your books, your materials, and every conversation you had near an open door. And I am a woman who spends her professional life reconstructing the hidden structure of damaged things. She held his gaze. What if I spent those 5 days understanding the Mercer account well enough to know something Forsyth doesn't? Damien was completely still. You didn't have access to, he started. I had access to 3 documents you left on the kitchen counter on the second day, she said, and to a conversation you had with Vincent on the 4th morning about a restructuring option you'd decided against, and to the specific language you used when you told Anton, in front of me, that you were going to move first. She paused. I didn't intend to analyze them. I just did because that's how my mind works. Give me a damaged thing, and I start figuring out how it was built. He stared at her. What did you figure out, he said. She told him. It took 12 minutes. She watched his face across those 12 minutes go through a progression that she had never seen from him. Genuine surprise, recognition, and then something that looked very much like the expression of a chess player who has just been shown a move they hadn't seen. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. That's correct, he said. That's entirely correct. And it's the one structural element that wasn't in any of the documents Anton gave Forsyth, because I'd never written it down. I kept it in my own head because it was the single most protected piece of the whole arrangement. And I reasoned it out from context, she said. In 5 days. I told you. I'm a fast study. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on anyone's face directed at her before. It wasn't admiration exactly, though it was adjacent to that. It was the expression of someone encountering something that had genuinely exceeded every expectation they arrived with. Elena, he said slowly, if you walk into that meeting tomorrow with that knowledge and you deploy it correctly. Forsyth has nothing, she said, because the information he bought from Anton is incomplete. And if I can demonstrate that I know what's missing, he has to decide whether the missing piece is worth more than his plan. It changes the negotiation entirely, Damien said. He comes in thinking he holds all the leverage, and he discovers that the leverage itself has a hole in it. That he paid a very high price to acquire, she said. And that I can either fill in or protect, depending on what happens in the room. The silence between them was different from all the silences before it. You realize, he said carefully, what you're proposing to do. Yes, you're proposing to make yourself useful to him, Damien said. Which is protection, but it's also exposure. If he decides you're a resource rather than a pressure point, He becomes interested in you in a different way. I know, she said, but it's less dangerous than being a pressure point. A resource has value you protect. A pressure point has value you use once and discard. He stared at her. You have thought about this for 5 days, he said. I had nothing else to do, she said. You wouldn't let me leave the building. Something broke open in his expression then, not dramatically, not completely, but enough. The corner of his mouth moved, a breath that might have been a laugh, contained before it arrived. You are, he said, the most unexpected person I have ever encountered. I'm a restoration specialist, she said. My entire career is finding the hidden structure inside damaged things and figuring out how to make them strong again. She paused. I've just been applying the same skill to a different kind of problem. He looked at her. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. He stood. She stood. They were close enough in the small space that the distance between them had an almost physical quality charged with everything that had accumulated in 17 days and not been said. Elena. His voice was quiet, careful, the way he said her name when he was giving her something he wasn't sure how to give. I know, she said, before he could continue. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to tell me to be careful, she said. And that if anything in that meeting goes wrong, you want me to look at you and not at him. He was still. Yes, he said. That's what I was going to say. I'll be careful, she said. And if it goes wrong, I'll look at you. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. She turned to go to the room she'd been shown. She was at the doorway when he spoke again. Elena. She turned back. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen in the kitchen at 2 a.m, stripped of performance, stripped of control, entirely honest. Thank you, he said, for staying. Not for the plan. Not for the strategy. For staying. She understood the difference completely. Get some sleep, she said gently. You have a long day tomorrow. She went to her room. She lay awake for a long time, thinking not about Forsyth or the meeting or the careful architecture of what they were building for tomorrow, but about the photograph on his shelf and the woman with his eyes and the word Carlotta had used. Break. She thought about what it meant to walk into a room tomorrow, carrying knowledge that could protect him. She thought about the fact that she was going to do it without hesitating. And she thought about what that said about 17 days, and a wrong turn at a charity auction, and a kiss she had told him was a mistake. He had said the mistake was believing she was powerless before she met him. Lying in the dark, Elena Marlowe thought that maybe the truth was more complicated than that. Maybe the mistake had never been the kiss at all. Maybe the mistake had been thinking, for one single second, that she would be able to walk away. She was ready before he was. That surprised him. He came out of his room at 6:45 in the morning to find Elena already at the kitchen table with coffee, a notepad covered in her small, precise handwriting, and the particular focused stillness of someone who had slept just enough and used the rest of the night productively. He stopped in the doorway. You've been up since 4, he said. 3:30, she said, without looking up. I kept thinking of variables. He crossed to the coffee maker. He poured a cup and came to stand beside the table and looked at the notepad without touching it. The writing was dense, not notes exactly, more like a map. Connections between names and figures and decisions, drawn in pencil with lines indicating relationships and arrows indicating direction of influence. It looked, he thought, like the kind of structural analysis his most experienced financial people spent weeks building. She had done it between 3:30 and 6:45 from memory. You did this from what you remembered, he said. Reconstruction is what I do, she said. I just usually do it with paint layers instead of financial structures. He sat down across from her. He looked at her across the table, the notepad between them, the morning quiet around them, the meeting that was 9 hours away pressing on the air, and he made a decision he had been approaching for days without letting himself arrive at it. I need to tell you something, he said. Before tonight. She looked up. His voice was level. Forsyth is going to try to use something specific against you in that room. Not against me, against you directly, she waited. He had a report compiled on you, Damien said. After Harwick filed his initial assessment, Forsyth commissioned a full background review. Your work history, your finances, your personal relationships, your family. He paused. Your father's debt. The stillness that came over Elena was a different kind than her usual stillness. This one had an edge to it. What do you know about my father's debt? She said. I know that your father borrowed a significant amount of money from a private lender. 12 years ago, Damien said carefully. I know that he died before it was repaid, and that the lender transferred the obligation to you informally, without legal standing, but persistently. I know that you have been making payments on a debt that was never legally yours for 9 years. Her expression didn't break, but her hands, flat on the table beside the notepad, pressed down slightly. How does Forsyth know that? She said. Because the lender your father borrowed from has a relationship with Forsyth's organization, Damien said. He's had access to that file for years. He simply hadn't had a reason to use it until now. A pause. He's going to offer to clear it, she said. Not a question. In the room in front of me, Damien said. He's going to offer to make 9 years of payments disappear in exchange for something that he'll frame as reasonable, in a way that's designed to make you look like someone who has been compromised from the beginning. He held her gaze. He wants me to question whether you were ever genuinely on my side. She looked at him steadily. And are you questioning it? She said. No, he said, without hesitation. I'm telling you because I don't want him to be the first person who says it to you. I don't want you to be blindsided in that room. She was quiet for a moment. He watched something move through her expression, not the pain of the information itself, but something more layered. The recognition that someone had looked at the most private burden of her life and turned it into ammunition. He doesn't know I know, she said. No. So when he brings it out, expecting it to be a surprise. It won't be, he said, which means you control your reaction, which means he loses the moment before it starts. She looked at him. You could have told me this last night, she said. Yes. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Because last night you were building something, he said. You were focused and certain, and I didn't want to put something painful in the middle of it. He paused. I waited until this morning, because this morning you needed the information, not the protection from it. She held his gaze for a long beat. That, she said quietly, is one of the most considerate things anyone has ever done for me. He said nothing. The debt is $47,000, she said. I have paid back 31 of it over 9 years. I have 16,000 left. Her voice was completely steady. It was not legally mine, but the man who held it implied strongly that my father's reputation, and certain other things, would be affected if I didn't maintain the payments. I was 25 years old, and I didn't have the resources to fight it properly. She paused. I have thought about it every month for 9 years. I know, he said. Forsyth thinks that's a wound, she said. He does. He's wrong, she said. It stopped being a wound the moment someone else knew about it. She looked at Damien directly. It was only a wound because I carried it alone. He looked at her across the table. There were things he wanted to say. He was aware of them, stacked behind the discipline he had spent 11 years building, pressing against it with an insistence that was becoming more difficult to manage every hour he spent in the same room as this woman. He said the one that was most immediately true. The debt is already gone, he said. I cleared it this morning. She stared at him. You what? At 5:30, he said. I made a call. The lender's relationship with Forsyth's organization made it a straightforward matter to reclassify the obligation and close it. He held her gaze. You owe nothing. Not 16,000. Not $1. It's done, Damien. Her voice was different. You can't just... I can't, he said. And I did. Not because I thought you needed it as a favor, but because someone used your father's death to build a lever against you, and that is not something I'm willing to leave in place. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were very bright. She did not cry. He had the sense that she had made a practice of not crying in front of people, and that the habit was strong enough to hold even now. But her voice when she spoke was not entirely steady. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. Go into that room tonight, and let Forsyth watch his best weapon turn into nothing. And something came back into her expression, the focused, certain quality he had seen, when he first came out and found her at the table. Stronger now. Cleaner. All right, she said. She picked up her pencil. Then let's finish preparing. The Whitmore Club was exactly the kind of place that understood, without being told, that certain conversations required privacy without isolation. The room Forsyth had reserved was on the second floor, private enough for candid conversation, visible enough from the corridor that nothing dramatic could happen without witnesses. They arrived at 7:50 for an 8 o'clock meeting. Forsyth was already there. Gerald Forsyth was a man who looked like someone's pleasant grandfather until you looked at his eyes. 61 years old, silver-haired, dressed in the unhurried way of someone who had never needed to perform wealth, because the wealth was simply true. He rose when they entered, courteous, which Elena recognized immediately as theater. He had two men with him. Damien had Vince, and a second who positioned himself near the door without announcement. Elena walked in beside Damien. Not behind him, beside him. Forsyth looked at her immediately. His expression was warm and attentive, and entirely calculated. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "I'm so glad you could join us." "Mr. Forsyth," she said pleasantly. They sat Damien to her left. Forsyth across the table, with his two men slightly behind. The room settled into the particular quiet of people who are about to say things they have been planning to say for a long time. Forsyth opened pleasantly. He always opened pleasantly. She had expected this from everything Damien had told her. He talked about the city, about shared interests, about the importance of stable relationships between organizations that had operated in parallel for years. His language was the language of business, careful and neutral, and designed to establish a framework in which everything that followed sounded reasonable. Damien let him talk. Elena watched Forsyth's eyes while his mouth said reasonable things, and she saw the mechanism underneath the assessment, the calculation, the real-time cataloging of data. He was watching both of them simultaneously, tracking reactions, measuring temperature. Then, after approximately 8 minutes of pleasantry, Forsyth looked at Elena directly. "I imagine," he said gently, "that this world is somewhat overwhelming for someone with your background." "I find it interesting," she said. "A restoration specialist," he said. "That's specialized work. You must have a very precise mind." "It helps," she said. "I've always admired precision," Forsyth said. He smiled. "In fact, I think precision is what's been missing from certain financial structures we've been discussing. The Mercer account, for example." Damien's expression didn't change. "I'm familiar with the Mercer account," Elena said. Forsyth's eyes moved to her with slightly more focus. "Are you?" he said. "In some detail," she said, a brief pause. "Just long enough to mean something." "Then you understand," Forsyth said, recovering smoothly, "that there are certain gaps in its current structure that leave several parties exposed." "I understand the gaps that were identified through the information you acquired," Elena said. "Yes." Something shifted in Forsyth's expression. "Still pleasant, but recalibrating. The information I acquired is fairly comprehensive," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It covers most of the external architecture very accurately." Anton was thorough. She said the name without weight, without drama, just as a fact. She watched it land on Forsyth's side of the table. "What it doesn't cover is the internal redundancy structure that exists below the visible level." Forsyth was very still. "The accounts have a secondary protection layer," Elena said, in the same pleasant, conversational tone. "Not documented anywhere externally because it was never written down. The Mercer account, as you know it, is structurally accurate. What you don't know is that it operates inside a larger architecture that makes the documented version functionally incomplete without a specific authorization sequence." She paused. "Which means the leverage you believe you have is leverage over a portion of the structure, not the whole." The silence that followed was the most complete silence she had ever sat inside. Forsyth looked at Damien. Damien looked back at him with the expression of a man who has been waiting patiently for a specific moment to arrive. "You shared this with her," Forsyth said. There was a new quality in his voice, not anger exactly. Recalibration. Rapid and invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Miss Marlowe has been involved in restructuring conversations for some time, Damien said. The lie was delivered with complete smoothness, not because it was a lie exactly, but because it reframed something true into something more useful. Forsyth looked back at Elena. She held his gaze pleasantly. So the question, Elena said, is not what you can do with the information you have. The question is whether a continuing conflict makes sense when the information is incomplete, and when the person who understands the complete structure is willing to sit at a table and have a productive conversation. Forsyth studied her for a long moment. You're offering something, he said. We're both here, she said. That's already an offer. She watched the calculation move behind his eyes. The pleasant grandfather expression had not changed. He was too disciplined for that. But underneath it, something was being restructured, and she recognized the feeling, because it was the same thing she did with damaged paintings. Finding the new load-bearing points. Deciding what could be salvaged. Miss Marlowe, Forsyth said, and his voice had changed slightly less theater, more directness. You understand that I had a different agenda coming into this meeting. I know, she said simply. You know about the debt, he said. Yes, she said. And I know it's been cleared, so if that was intended to be useful to you this evening, I'd set it aside. A pause. Damien cleared it, Forsyth said. Not quite a question. This morning, she said. Forsyth looked at Damien again. This time, what moved through his expression was something Elena hadn't expected to see from a man like him. Respect. Grudging, reluctant but genuine. You moved faster than I anticipated, Forsyth said to Damien. I usually do, Damien said. Another pause, longer this time. Then Forsyth said, What are the terms of the conversation you're proposing? And Elena felt the meeting shift, felt it physically, like the moment in a restoration when the cleaning solution finally releases a layer of grime, and you can see, for the first time, what was always underneath. The meeting had been a confrontation. Now it was a negotiation. She looked at Damien. He gave her the smallest nod. She turned back to Forsyth. The Mercer account remains intact, she said. The structure that you currently know about provides a framework for a formal boundary agreement between your organization and Damien's. Not because anyone is forced into it, but because the alternative continued conflict with incomplete information on your side is a worse outcome for everyone. And the information I'm missing, Forsyth said. Stays missing, she said. As insurance, not as a weapon, as the thing that keeps this conversation permanently preferable to the alternative. Forsyth looked at her for a very long moment. You're 27 years old, he said. You restore paintings. I understand structure, she said. Damaged or otherwise. He was quiet. Then he said something that made the temperature in the room change entirely. Damien, he said, not looking away from Elena. You realize she is considerably more dangerous than you are. Damien said, without inflection, I am aware of that. Elena kept her expression neutral and felt something move through her that she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. Not pride exactly, something more grounded than that. The feeling of standing in the right place, doing the right thing, being fully and completely herself in a room where everything had been designed to diminish her. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. By the end of it, the outline of an agreement existed, not final, not signed, but structural. Enough to de-escalate what had been building for months. Enough to remove Elena from the equation as a pressure point permanently, because Forsyth had reclassified her in his thinking, and a reclassified resource was no longer leverage. When they stood to leave, Forsyth extended his hand to Elena. She shook it. I hope, he said pleasantly, that you'll be a continuing presence in these conversations. That depends on the conversations, she said. He smiled, and this time, just barely, it reached his eyes. In the car afterward, she sat beside Damien, and neither of them spoke for 3 full blocks. Then he said, You were extraordinary. She had been told she was good at things before. Supervisors had praised her work. Colleagues had complimented her precision. She had received professional recognition in the careful, measured language of institutional appreciation. Nobody had ever said it the way he said it. You did the hard part, she said. 11 hours of calls. 8 years of building something worth protecting. I've done that work 100 times, he said. What you did in that room is something I've never seen before. She turned to look at him. In the dark of the car, with the city moving past the windows, he looked like someone who had put down something very heavy and hadn't yet decided whether to pick it back up. Damien, she said. Are you all right? He looked at her. I want to tell you something, he said. And I need you to hear it as something I mean, not something the situation requires. She waited. The arrangement we made, he said. 1 month. Being seen together. Protecting you from Forsyth. He paused. I would like you to know that somewhere in the last 18 days, the arrangement stopped being the reason. The car moved through an intersection. She held very still. Stopped being the reason for what? She said. Carefully. Because she needed to hear it said completely. For wanting you here, he said. Silence. Damien, I know, he said. I know what I am. I know what this world looks like from the outside. I know that what I'm saying asks something of you that has nothing to do with debt or protection or convenient arrangements. He held her gaze steadily. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just not willing to let another day go by without being honest about what's true. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do, indifferent and alive and full of people who had no idea that two people in a moving car were sitting with the weight of something that had grown much larger than either of them planned for. The night of the auction, she said slowly. When you told me the mistake was believing I was powerless before I met you. Yes, he said. I thought you were being deliberately enigmatic, she said. Using language as a strategy, he said. Partly. And the other part? He looked at her with the expression she had now seen enough times to know was him being as honest as he knew how to be. The other part was that I saw someone standing in a corridor who should have been terrified, who was terrified, and who refused to let that be the whole story. He paused. I had spent 11 years in a world where everyone let fear be the whole story, because fear of me was useful. And you stood there and told me, without saying it directly, that I was not the most important thing in the room. His voice was quiet. I had forgotten what it felt like to be in a room where I wasn't the most important thing. She felt that move through her, not dramatically, not with the sudden rush of a moment from a film, but the way real things moved. Slowly, settling somewhere deep and permanent. I kissed you to distract Harwick, she said. I know, and then I told you it was a mistake. You did. And you said.
The mistake was believing you were powerless, he said.
Yes, I've thought about that every day since, she said. So have I, he said. The car slowed. They were back at the Meridian building. Neither of them moved to get out. I'm not the same person I was 18 days ago, she said. I don't know if that's good or frightening or both. Both, he said. Almost always both. She looked at him. I'm not going to pretend I don't feel what I feel, she said. I've been trying that strategy for about 16 days, and it's not working. Something broke open in his expression the same way it had broken open in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, but wider this time. More complete. What do you feel? He said quietly. She thought about Carlotta's warning. The word break. The question of whether what existed between them was the best thing that had happened to him in 11 years or the thing that would break what couldn't be repaired. She thought about standing in that room and watching Forsyth recalibrate in real time and feeling, for the first time in her adult life, that the choice to be present fully, completely, without hiding was not a risk but a rightness. I feel like I walked into a building 17 days ago, looking for the powder room, she said. And I found something I didn't know I was missing. She held his gaze. I feel like you are the most complicated thing I have ever tried to understand, and I find that I don't want to stop. He reached across the seat. He took her hand, not the careful edge-touching gesture from the car the night before. He took her hand completely, the way you held something you were afraid of losing. I have never, he started and stopped. I know, she said. I don't know how to do this, he said. Whatever this is. Neither do I, she said. But I'm not powerless. You told me that. The corner of his mouth moved. I did say that, he acknowledged. So we figure it out, she said. He looked at her. Together, he said. Together, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he brought her hand up, and he pressed his lips to her knuckles, not dramatic, not performed, just a gesture of such complete sincerity that she felt it move from her hand all the way through her. "We should go inside," he said. "Yes," she said. "We should." Neither of them moved for another full minute. And in that minute, without any drama or announcement, the arrangement that had started with a wrong turn and a necessary lie became something that neither of them had a clean word for yet, but that both of them recognized as real, in the way that only true things were real, not because it was easy or safe or for simple, but because it was undeniably, irrevocably there. When they finally went inside, Carlotta was waiting. She looked at them, at their joined hands, at the quality of the silence between them, at whatever showed on both their faces, that neither of them was managing carefully enough to hide. She looked at Damien for a long moment. Then she looked at Elena. "Well," she said, and her voice had none of the warning of 2 nights ago, and all of something that might, cautiously, have been relief. "It's about time." She walked past them without waiting for a response. Vincent, to his credit, said nothing at all. But Elena, paying attention to everything the way she always did, noticed that the large, expressionless man who had guarded her for 18 days and answered questions with minimum information and maximum accuracy was, very quietly, smiling. That night, after Damien had made the calls that needed to be made and reviewed what the meeting had produced and done all the things that running an organization at this level required, he found Elena in the kitchen. She was not reading, she was not making notes. She was just sitting at the table with her hands around a cup of tea, looking at the middle distance, with the expression of someone processing something large and choosing to do it quietly. He sat down across from her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She came back from wherever she'd been. "I'm thinking about damaged things," she said. "About how you can't always tell from the outside how much structural integrity remains. Some things look destroyed and they're not. Some things look intact and they're hollow all the way through." She paused. "The skill is in reading the material, understanding what it's made of. Not assuming damage means loss." He looked at her across the kitchen table. "Are you talking about the Mercer account?" he said. "No," she said. He was quiet. "I spent 9 years paying a debt that wasn't mine," she said. "And I thought of it as a wound, the weight of something I couldn't put down." She met his eyes. "You cleared it in one phone call this morning, and I sat here tonight, realizing that the wound was never the debt. The wound was believing I had to carry it alone." He held her gaze. "You don't," he said. "Anymore." "I know," she said. "That's what I'm thinking about." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. And they sat together in the kitchen, in the quiet of a night that had held more weight and more truth than either of them had expected, while the city moved outside and the agreement with Forsyth settled into something real, and the long, complicated, irreversible work of two people building something genuine from the most unlikely beginning continued, one honest moment at a time. The agreement held for 6 days before someone tried to break it. Not Forsyth. That was the part nobody anticipated. Forsyth had done what men like Forsyth did when they recognized a calculation had shifted. He had adapted. The conversation at the Whitmore Club had restructured the terms sufficiently that moving against Damien directly no longer made mathematical sense. Forsyth was many things, but he was not a man who spent resources on losing propositions. The border agreement stood. The Mercer account remained intact. The coalition he had tried to build had dissolved before it formed. The threat that arrived on the 7th morning came from somewhere else entirely. It came from inside. Not Anton. Anton's situation had been resolved in the days after his phone call, in a way that Damien had handled with a complexity that surprised everyone who expected ruthlessness. He had protected Anton's son in Detroit, quietly and without announcement, through channels that cost him something significant and that he did not discuss. He had removed Anton from operational involvement permanently. And he had done both things without the public consequence that Anton had expected, which meant Anton spent the rest of his days carrying a different kind of weight, not fear, but the heavier burden of understanding that the man he had betrayed had refused to become what the betrayal deserved. Elena learned about this not from Damien but from Carlotta, who told her over coffee one morning, with the blunt economy of someone who respected directness above all. "He did it because of you," Carlotta said. "He did it because it was right," Elena said. "Those two things," Carlotta said, "are not mutually exclusive." The new threat came from a man named Paul Renner. He was 38 years old, had been in the organization for 6 years, and had spent the last 4 of those years building a quiet, patient resentment toward Damien that nobody had measured correctly because Renner was excellent at appearing loyal. He had watched the Forsyth situation resolve. He had watched Damien navigate a crisis that should have fractured the organization and instead appeared to have strengthened it. And he had calculated, with the particular logic of someone who believed the right moment to move was when the leader was most distracted, that now was the time. What Renner had not calculated was Elena. She had been back at the Hargrove Museum for 4 days, a return to normal. Margaret delighted, the fleshport waiting with the patience of something that had survived 400 years and could manage another 3 weeks. Damien had insisted on a driver, which Elena had accepted as a reasonable compromise, and her days had settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, like something that might be sustainable. She was in the restoration lab on a Thursday afternoon when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Miss Marlowe." The voice was male, professional, entirely neutral. "My name is Paul Renner. I'm a senior operational coordinator for the Moretti organization." She set down her tools. "Mr. Renner," she said. Her voice gave nothing away. "I'm calling because there's a situation that requires your involvement," he said. "Damien has been in an emergency meeting since this morning and has been, let's say, insulated from certain communications. I'm coordinating responses on his behalf." Every instinct she had sharpened at once. "What kind of situation?" she said. "The Forsyth Agreement has a complication," Renner said. "A financial component that requires your authorization, the component you discussed at the Whitmore Club." She was very still. She had discussed a structural element at the Whitmore Club. A real one. The internal redundancy architecture she had reasoned out from 5 days of careful attention. She had used it as leverage, as protection, as the thing that shifted the meeting from confrontation to negotiation. It was not something that anyone outside that room should know in the specific terms Renner was referencing. Which meant one of 3 things. Either Renner had been in the room he hadn't, she had noted every face. Or someone who had been in the room had talked. Or Renner was testing her with partial information, probing to see how much she knew, and whether she could be manipulated with it. "I don't authorize anything through phone calls I didn't initiate," she said pleasantly. "If Damien needs something from me, he'll call me himself." "Damien is unavailable," Renner said. "That's what I'm explaining." "Then whatever needs authorizing can wait until he's available," she said. "Thank you for calling, Mr. Renner." She hung up. She called Damien immediately. He answered on the second ring, which told her immediately that he was not in an emergency meeting and had not been insulated from anything. "Are you all right?" he said. The fact that he answered with that instead of a greeting told her he had seen the call come in and had been about to reach out himself. "I just got a call from someone named Paul Renner," she said. 2 seconds of silence. "Say that again," he said. She said it again. She repeated the conversation verbatim, with the precision of someone who listened to everything and retained it. By the time she finished, the quality of the silence on his end had changed into something she recognized as controlled urgency moving fast. "Go to Margaret's office," he said. "Stay there until Vincent arrives. Don't go anywhere alone." "How long?" 20 minutes. "Elena." His voice was very calm and very serious. "Renner does not work on my behalf. He has never been authorized to contact you. The fact that he did, using specific language from the Whitmore Club meeting, means the situation is more complicated than I realized this morning." She processed that. "He has someone who was in that room," she said. "Or he has equipment I didn't account for," Damien said. "Either way, this is no longer just Renner." She stood up from her workstation. "I'll go to Margaret," she said. "Thank you," he said. And the way he said it, compressed and urgent, and underneath all that, Something that was pure relief that she had called immediately told her everything about how serious this was. She went to Margaret's office. Margaret, to her enormous credit, asked exactly one question, received a partial answer, and poured Elena a cup of tea without further comment. Elena sat in the comfortable chair across from Margaret's desk and thought, while Margaret pretended to review paperwork, about Paul Renner and what he had wanted. Not authorization. That had been theater. He had wanted to know how much she knew and whether she could be separated from Damien's protection long enough to become useful to whatever Renner was building. She had answered both questions by hanging up. Vincent arrived in 18 minutes. Damien was at the Meridian building when she arrived, and he was not alone. Carlotta was there. Two men she had seen before but not been introduced to were positioned outside the office door. And seated at the conference table with the expression of someone who had been summoned and understood exactly why, was a woman named Diane Chu, Damien's head of internal security, who Elena was meeting for the first time under circumstances that established her immediately as someone you wanted very much to be on your side. Renner has been building a parallel structure for 8 months, Diane said, without preamble. We found the outline of it this morning after a routine financial audit flagged 3 anomalies. The phone call to Miss Marlowe accelerated our timeline significantly. What kind of parallel structure? Elena asked. Everyone in the room looked at her not with surprise exactly, but with the slight adjustment of people recalibrating to include someone they hadn't expected to be part of the conversation. Damien said she stays continue. Diane continued. Renner has been positioning himself as an alternative authority within the organization. Carefully, incrementally nothing that would trigger obvious flags. He's built loyalty from approximately 14 people across 4 operational areas. His plan, as far as we can reconstruct it, was to wait for a moment of significant external pressure, the Forsyth situation, ideally, and present himself as a stabilizing alternative when the organization appeared most vulnerable. The Forsyth situation resolved, Elena said, which is why he moved to the secondary plan, Diane said. If the external crisis couldn't destabilize Damien's leadership, he needed an internal one. Miss Marlowe is the internal one. Elena looked at her steadily. He was going to use me to make the case that Damien had compromised the organization's security. Specifically that by bringing an outsider into operational conversations, Damien had created a liability. That the Whitmore Club meeting had given an unknown civilian knowledge that should never have left the organization. Diane paused. That the personal relationship had replaced professional judgment. The room was very quiet. Elena thought about 9 years of carrying a debt alone. She thought about standing in a corridor being told she was powerless. She thought about 5 days in a townhouse building a map in pencil from memory, and a meeting where she had watched a man's entire strategy dissolve in real time. She thought about the specific cruelty of turning someone's presence into evidence of weakness. He's wrong, she said. Her voice was completely level. Not just about the conclusion, about the premise. Carlotta, from the corner of the room, said nothing. But Elena felt her attention sharpen. The Whitmore Club meeting was not a liability, Elena said. It was the resolution of a 6-month crisis in a single evening, without violence, without public exposure, and without conceding anything structural. If Renner wants to build a case that including me in that conversation was a mistake, he'll need to account for what the alternative looked like. Diane looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Damien. Damien was looking at Elena, with an expression that she recognized by now, the one that said he was seeing her clearly, without the filter of everything the world had told him to expect. And finding that what was there exceeded the expectation by a distance he had stopped trying to measure. "Where is Renner now?" Damien asked Diane. "He's at the Lakeshore office," Diane said. "He doesn't know we've mapped the structure. He thinks the call to Miss Marlowe gave him time, that she either complied or was confused enough that he has a window." "He has until this afternoon," Damien said. "Call a full senior meeting at 4. Every operational head, everyone Renner has built loyalty with, is going to be in the same room." "And Renner?" Diane asked. Damien was quiet for a moment. "Invite him," he said. Elena was not in the 4 o'clock meeting. She had not expected to be, and she had not asked. This was not her territory, it was Damien's, the part of his world that operated by its own logic, and the resolution of Paul Renner was not something she needed to witness. What she understood, from everything she had learned in 3 weeks, was that Damien's response to betrayal had a pattern. It was measured, it was decisive, and it was always more complicated than the simple response anyone expected. She found out afterward from Carlotta, who told her with the particular satisfaction of someone who had watched something go exactly the way it should. Damien had walked into that meeting and addressed Renner's case before Renner could make it. He had laid out the parallel structure, the 8 months of quiet positioning, the 14 people, the plan to use Elena as the instrument of a manufactured crisis. He had done it calmly, in front of every senior member of the organization, and he had asked one question when he finished. He had asked, was there anyone in the room who believed the Forsyth resolution had been a mistake? Silence. He had asked, was there anyone who believed that the organization was weaker now than it had been 3 months ago? More silence. He had looked at Renner and said, the only thing you correctly identified is that I made a decision that surprised you. You mistook surprise for vulnerability. I'd encourage you not to make the same mistake twice. Renner had been removed from operational involvement that afternoon. The 14 people had been redistributed. The parallel structure dissolved without violence, without public incident, without anything that would register as instability to anyone watching from outside. When Carlotta finished telling her, Elena sat quietly for a moment. He handled it as if it were a structural problem, she said. Not a personal betrayal. Yes, Carlotta said. He's done that before. With Anton, Carlotta said. And once before that. In the first year, she paused. He used to do the opposite. In the beginning, betrayal was he responded from the wound. Directly. It was effective, but it cost him things he didn't recover easily. She looked at Elena. He stopped doing it about 4 years into leadership. He said his father's approach had been to make examples, and that examples were expensive. When did he start responding the way he did today? Elena asked. Carlotta was quiet for a moment. That response, she said carefully, has a quality I have not seen from him before. Elena looked at her. He addressed the argument before it could be made, Carlotta said. He removed the ground from under it. And the specific framing he used, that Renner had mistaken surprise for vulnerability, that is not language Damien has ever used before. It's the language of someone who has had a reason to think carefully about what vulnerability actually means, Elena said quietly. Carlotta held her gaze. Yes, she said. That is exactly what it is. He came to find her that evening. She was back at the Meridian building. Her things had been there since the move from the townhouse, and the quiet understanding between them was that she was not in a hurry to move them. And neither of them was going to make that conversation awkward by announcing what it meant. He came in, and he sat down, and he looked like someone who had finished something heavy and was only now feeling the weight of having carried it. It's done, he said. I know. Carlotta told me. He looked at her. Something flickered across his face that was not quite surprise. He had long since stopped being surprised by the things Carlotta chose to share with Elena, but was adjacent to it. Are you all right, she asked. Yes, he said. Then no. Not entirely. She waited. Renner was with me from the beginning, he said. Not as long as Anton. But 6 years is not a short time, he paused. I keep finding that the people who believe they know this world best are the ones who understand it least. Renner thought using you against me was the logical move. He thought you were the weak point. I know, she said. He doesn't understand, Damien said, that you are not a weak point. You are the reason the weak points are fewer than they were. She looked at him. I've been thinking, she said, about what comes next. He was still. Not in terms of us, she said quickly. I mean, in terms of what you're building, what the organization becomes. You handled Anton without punishment in the traditional sense. You handled Renner by removing the ground from his argument instead of making an example of him. Those are not small decisions. They're a pattern. I know what pattern they are, he said. Do you know where it leads? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment. My father believed the organization could only survive through fear, he said. 30 years of building something on the premise that people had to be afraid to be loyal. He paused. I have spent 8 years running a version of that same organization, and I have been telling myself that what I was doing was different enough. Cleaner, more sophisticated. Another pause, and then you walked in and you started asking questions, and the answers I was giving myself stopped making sense. She held his gaze. I want to build something that doesn't require fear, he said. It came out slowly, like something he had been holding for a long time and was only now trusting enough to say aloud. I don't know if that's possible in this world. I don't know if the infrastructure I've inherited allows for it. But I know that every decision I've made in the past 3 weeks, Anton, the Forsyth Agreement, Renner, they've all been moves toward something different from what I was trained to build. You know what I think? She said. Tell me. I think you've been moving toward it for longer than 3 weeks, she said. I think the 3 weeks just gave you someone to say it to. He looked at her. Is that what you are, he said. Someone to say it to? Among other things, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Among other things, he repeated. She leaned forward slightly. I'm going to say something, she said. And I need you to hear it as something I've thought about carefully, not as a reaction to everything that's happened. All right, he said. I want to stay, she said, not because of the arrangement. Not because of Forsyth or Renner or the Mercer account or any of the specific circumstances that put me here. I want to stay because I have not been more fully myself in any context in my adult life than I have been in the past 3 weeks. She held his gaze. And because you are the most genuinely complicated person I have ever encountered, and I am not finished understanding you. A pause. I am not going to be finished for a very long time. He was very still, Elena, he said. His voice was quiet and entirely serious. I need to be honest with you about something. You're always honest with me, she said. That was the whole point. I have been honest about the situation, he said. About Forsyth, about Renner, about the things you needed to know to be safe. He paused. I have not been fully honest about what this has meant to me. She waited. I have spent 11 years, he said slowly, building walls around the parts of myself that this world targets. Not because I was broken, because I was protecting the things that could be broken. He looked at her steadily. I stopped letting people see those parts, because every time someone saw them, they became tools. They became the edges of a wound someone could press. His voice was controlled, and underneath it was something that was not controlled at all. You saw those parts from the first week. The books. My mother's photograph. The kitchen. He paused. And you didn't press. You just stayed with it. She said nothing. Nobody has done that before, he said. Not once. In 11 years. She felt that land in her chest with the full weight of what it meant, not as something romantic, though it was that too, but as something more fundamental. The weight of a person who had been alone with the truest parts of themselves for 11 years and had decided for the first time to stop. You said something to me on the first night, she said quietly. You said the mistake was believing I was powerless before I met you. I remember. I've been thinking about that for 3 weeks, she said. And I think it goes both ways. He looked at her. You had all this power, she said, and you were completely alone inside it. Not because you weren't strong enough, but because nobody had ever made it safe to be anything else. She paused. That's a different kind of powerlessness. He was quiet for so long that she thought she might have gone too far. Then he said, yes, that's exactly what it is. She reached across and put her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held hers the way he had in the car, completely, without reservation, the way you held something you had decided not to let go of. Then maybe, she said, that's what we do for each other. He looked at her. Make it safe to be something else, he said. Make it safe, she said, to be the whole thing. 3 months later, the Hargrove Museum held its winter exhibition opening, and Elena Marlowe stood in front of the restored Flemish portrait, 2 years of work, finally complete, and explained to a small group of interested visitors how the process worked. She talked about reading the damage, about understanding that what looked like destruction was often just concealment, about the patience required to work backward from what existed to what had been there originally, and then forward again to something that could stand on its own. She talked about the difference between restoration and reconstruction. Restoration meant returning to an original state as faithfully as possible. Reconstruction meant building something new that honored what had been there before without being limited by it. She was talking about the painting. She was also, and she knew this completely, talking about something else. Damien was standing at the edge of the group. He had come without announcement, which was how he did most things that mattered to him. He was in a dark coat, slightly apart from the other guests, and he was listening to her talk about restoration with the expression she had come to know, as him absorbing something he would think about long after the conversation ended. When the small group dispersed, he came to stand beside her in front of the painting. "You never told me which painting it was," he said. "You never asked." He looked at it. A portrait of a woman 17th century, Dutch, her identity lost to history, but her face entirely present. Direct gaze, composed expression, the particular quality of someone who had consented to be seen. "She looks like she knew exactly what she was doing," he said. "Most of them did," Elena said. "Sitting for a portrait was a considered choice. You had to be willing to be seen." He looked at the painting for a moment. "I have a meeting next week," he said, "with a group of people who run legitimate development projects in the South Side. I've been in conversations with them for a month." She turned to look at him. "What kind of development projects?" she said. "The kind that need investment and structure, and someone who understands how to operate in complicated environments." He paused. "The Moretti organization has both, and I have been considering, very carefully, what it would mean to put them to work in a way that builds something instead of protecting something." She was quiet for a moment. "Is this what I think it is?" she said. "It's a beginning," he said. "Not a transformation. Not an announcement. One meeting, with one group in one part of the city." He looked at her. "But a genuine beginning." She thought about what he had said 3 months ago, about building something that didn't require fear, about not knowing if the infrastructure he had inherited allowed for it, about every decision being a move towards something different. "What made you decide to start now?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "You told me that restoration and reconstruction were different things," he said. "That restoration meant returning to what was there before. But reconstruction meant building something new that honored what existed without being limited by it." He paused. "I've been trying to restore something for 8 years. Something my father built that I told myself I could refine into something better." He held her gaze. "I think what I actually need to do is reconstruct." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's terrifying," she said. "Yes," he said. "And you're going to do it anyway." "Yes," he said again. "Because someone once told me that courage isn't having no fear. It's making a choice despite it." She smiled. "I said that," she said. "You did," he said. "In a kitchen at 2 in the morning. You were listening." "I always listen," he said. "To you especially." She turned back to the painting for a moment. The woman in the portrait looked back at them with her composed, direct gaze present, willing, entirely herself. "She's beautiful," Damien said quietly. "She survived 400 years of damage," Elena said. "And she's still here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to tell you something." She turned to look at him. 3 weeks ago, the night after the Renner situation, I went back to my office after you'd gone to sleep, and I sat there for an hour thinking about what you'd said." He held her gaze. "That I'd had all this power and been completely alone inside it. That nobody had made it safe to be anything else." He paused. "I thought about my father, about the 11 years, about every decision I'd made that I told myself was strategy, but that was also, in some measure, loneliness wearing the clothing of strength." She held very still, and I thought about a woman who walked through a wrong door 3 months ago and refused to pretend she hadn't seen Troy saw. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "And I understood that the thing I'd been most afraid of, the thing I'd been building walls against for 11 years, wasn't vulnerability at all. It was this, specifically this, someone who saw every broken part of what I am and decided to stay anyway." He reached up and touched her face, her cheek. Briefly, the way you touched something you were still, after everything, slightly afraid to believe was real. "I love you," he said. "I don't have a better way to say it than that." She felt it move through her, all of it. 3 months of kitchens and wrong turns, and documents in pencil, and a meeting at the Whitmore Club, and a debt cleared by phone call at 5:30 in the morning, and a hand held across a car seat in the dark. All of it arriving at this moment, in front of a 400-year-old painting, in a life she had not planned and could not have imagined, and would not trade for anything safe, or simple, or invisible. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying not to say it first." Something broke completely open in his face, not the almost smile, not the controlled warmth, but the full, genuine, unguarded thing that she had caught glimpses of for 3 months, and that was, she thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "You could have said it first," he said. "You needed to," she said. "I could tell." He made a sound, a real laugh, brief and warm, the kind that said he was entirely present in the moment, not managing it, not analyzing it, just in it. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him. They stood together in front of the portrait of a woman who had consented, 4 centuries ago, to be seen, and they were quiet for a moment, in the way that people were quiet when something had settled into its right place, and the settling itself was the only thing worth noticing. People would talk about Damien Moretti for years after. They would talk about the Southside Development Initiative, which began with one meeting and became, over time, something that changed the material reality of several thousand lives in ways that nobody in the city had expected from the Moretti name. They would talk about the border agreement with Forsyth, which held not because anyone was afraid, but because both sides had found it consistently more productive than the alternative. They would talk about the way the organization changed, slowly and without announcement, from something that operated on fear toward something that operated on loyalty that had been earned rather than coerced. Some people called it weakness. The people who had been inside it, who had watched it change from close enough to understand and cost and what it built, knew the truth. They would also talk about Elena Marlowe, the restoration specialist from the Hargrove Museum who had walked through a wrong door at a charity auction and never quite walked back out, who had sat in a room with Gerald Forsyth and dismantled his leverage in 12 minutes, who had called Damien Moretti the moment Paul Renner's voice gave itself away, who had spent 3 months asking questions that nobody else had thought to ask, and who had understood, from the very beginning, that the most important thing about a damaged structure was not what it looked like on the surface, but what remained intact underneath. They talked about her because she was impossible to ignore, and because she was in her own quiet way, as formidable as the man beside her. And in the kitchen of the Meridian Building, on a Tuesday evening several months after a painting was restored, and certain things were said in a museum gallery, Damien Moretti sat across from Elena Marlowe and watched her read and thought about the night everything had started. She had kissed him to distract him. She had stepped back and told him it was a mistake. And he had looked at her in the fluorescent quiet of a gallery and said the only thing that was true. He picked up his coffee cup. "You're staring," Elena said, without looking up from her book. "I'm thinking," he said. "About what?" He was quiet for a moment. "About the Whitmore Club," he said. "And Forsyth's face when you told him the leverage had a hole in it." She looked up. The corner of her mouth moved. "He recovered remarkably quickly," she said. "He did," Damien said. "He told me afterward privately that you were the only person who had ever walked into one of his meetings and changed the meeting before he could start it." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was not a surprise to me," Damien said, "and that he should count himself lucky she was on my side of the table." She smiled fully, warmly, the smile that still did something to him, that he had given up pretending it didn't. "I am," she said. "For the record." "I know," he said. She went back to her book. He watched her for another moment. 3 months ago, a woman had walked through a wrong door and refused to pretend she hadn't seen what she saw. She had stood in a corridor and told him she was afraid, but she wasn't going to let that be the only thing she was. She had sat in a kitchen at 2 in the morning and made coffee and told him to sit down and waited for him to be ready. She had walked into a room full of danger and changed every calculation in it without raising her voice once. She had looked at 11 years of walls and started asking what was behind them. And what was behind them, what had always been behind them, patient and intact despite everything, waiting for someone willing to stay long enough to find. It was simply this: a man capable of love, who had never been given a safe enough reason to show it. Until her. The kiss had not been a mistake. It had been the only door in the room that opened into something real, and Elena Marlowe, who understood structure and damage and the difference between what was lost and what was only hidden, had been exactly the person to walk through it.